Hi everyone, it's QuickyBaby and welcome back to World of Tanks. An update 1.27.1 is here and it brings tremendous buffs to the Type 71. But this game is going to be from the previous patch and I want to talk about why the Type 71 was, in my opinion, the worst tier 10 tank of all time. I think it's worse than an FV215B ever was. I think it's even worse than the FV405, because at least the FV405 can be a little bit of fun, right? When you're occasionally having a good time with it. The Type 71, in its pre-buffed state, last patch lasted for an entire year. It was a tank which I just absolutely, truly hated to play. I gave it a go. The first 50 games, I got very frustrated with the tank, thought it absolutely sucked, and then I thought, okay, I'm going to try ultra hard with this vehicle and see what I can possibly do. And then I got my win ratio back up to like about 53-54% in this tank. And then recently I went on a quest to start 3-marking the Type 71, and I was getting like about 4,100, 4,200 combined. Which may sound good, but for me, when I'm sweating and trying as hard as I possibly can, it's probably about 10 or 20% below where I would be with pretty much all of the other tier 10 heavy tanks inside the game. And so the Type 71 has just absolutely destroyed my win ratio trying to 3-mark this thing before the buff that came onto the European server yesterday. I was averaging like 45% wins in this vehicle, even though I was getting that 4.1k combined. Now, was it because I was playing too safe in the tank? Maybe a little bit. Maybe I actually started to artificially increase my combines and actually lower my win ratio because I wasn't willing to go and drive into multiple heavy tanks. Instead, try and be a little bit sneaky and try and come up with a plan. And what you see right here is coming up with the kind of plan where a Type 71 can actually be successful inside World of Tanks. The reason why this vehicle was so horrendous for an entire year, in the entirety of 2024, right up until now when it has been buffed, and stay tuned as I'm going to be showing you what this vehicle is capable of in its buffed state. Not in today's video, but in a subsequent video coming up in the next week or two. The Type 71 was just absolutely horrific because of the biggest problem of this tank's design. And that is that it does have 12 degrees of gun depression, but to be able to achieve its 12 degrees of gun depression, it uses the 7 degrees of gun depression that the gun can use naturally. So from here to here would be about 7 degrees. But to be able to use more than that, it has to use its hydropneumatic suspension, where it raises the rear of the tank and lowers the front. Now, the problem with that, with a vehicle, is that if you've only got 7 degrees of gun depression, your hydropneumatic suspension kicks in, that means that the hull armor never actually reaches a really good level of angling. And so the problem was that the Type 71 could never get above like 70 degrees of angled armor on its upper hull if it was still wanting to shoot its opponents. And its armor was 120 millimeters. There are medium tanks that kind of have better penetration than, or better armor than that, I should say. And it was just an absolute unmitigated disaster. The other thing, this was a very important part of the game here, was that while this tank had and has great damage per minute, better than the Super Conqueror now, pretty much what the Super Conqueror used to be like, if you wanted to use that fabulous damage per minute, you would have to sacrifice pretty much all of the accuracy of the vehicle. Its accuracy before the cooldown was 0.42, which was one of the worst accuracies on any of the heavy tanks, even worse than the derpy tanks. And as you can see, it has this double aiming mode, where you can see that there's actually 2 reticles on the screen. One very transparent around the outside, and then on the inside. So if you wanted to fire at full speed, then you'd be using the outside reticle, which used to be 0.42. If you want to use the inside reticle, it was a very good 0.28. However, the cooldown delay was 12 seconds, which was kind of like double the reload of the vehicle. So you would be firing 5 rounds a minute instead of like 7 rounds a minute that you'd be achieving if you want to use kind of like the full speed. Now, that's great in a situation like you just saw, where you do have time to fully aim, and it's great for a situation like this where you don't need the accuracy, where you can really let rip on the Panzer 7. But it's just frustrating, and it meant that you were kind of always trying to make the best of bad decisions, and I hate trying to make the best of bad decisions in World of Tanks. Because if I'm being forced to make the best of bad decisions, then I'm always going to be bad in that kind of a scenario. By far, the biggest issue was not really this double aiming mechanic, even though it was incredibly frustrating. You know, I'm just sitting there waiting to aim just a little bit more to actually be able to try and pinpoint the weakness of the Panzer VII's mantlet, and quite often it could be very tilting in that regard. And then even when you're double aimed with the old .28 accuracy, you'd still sometimes miss. But the biggest issue by far on this vehicle was that whenever you exposed any of the hull armor, it just got absolutely ripped apart because of the lack of gun depression that this vehicle has when it's not using the hydropneumatic. And as I explained, when you use the hydropneumatic, then that tilts the tank's armor to be flatter towards your opponent's guns and allows them to easily penetrate you. Wargaming have made massive buffs to this tank. They've buffed up the accuracy of the vehicle from .28 inside its double aiming to now .22. Making it in the current patch the most accurate tank in the game, bar none. I guess you could argue that something like an STRV, if it sacrificed 3% of its rate of fire, could maybe get over the Type 71, but having played the Type 71 yesterday, I can tell you, oh man, it just feels absolutely great with that new best in game accuracy of .22. And also, they've buffed the accuracy before the cooldown from .42 to .38 as well. And so that means that even if you're letting rip and not double aiming in this tank, you've still got fairly okay accuracy. And then you've just got good damage per minute. It kind of feels a bit like a T10 within that regard. So it's now kind of a choice, whereas previously it did feel that you'd just have cursed accuracy at most ranges, unless you would try and use that full speed fire. On top of that, Wargaming have massively buffed that armor on the vehicle. I cannot stress how much the armor buff really makes a difference on this tank. And so you don't really have to just try and face hug and try and get them to just shoot you in the turret now. You can actually bait people with your hull armor occasionally and not just try and outfight a Panzer VII in close quarters combat by spamming gold at his lower plate in this scenario. Now the hull armor's gone up to 165, but while I'm fighting this, let me pause and tell you about the Type 71's armor model just quickly here. And that is that the armor model has this really frustrating wing that comes across here. So what does that mean when you side scrape? That means that when you side scrape that it's flat and it's easy to penetrate. But Wargaming didn't only buff the frontal hull from 120 up to 165, they've also buffed the wing armor here, which means that you can side scrape now against vehicles up to about like the 260 millimeters of penetration mark. So they're really going to have to fire gold and then hit that wing to be able to take advantage of you. And if that wasn't enough, Wargaming also buffed the top speed limit of this tank from 35 up to 40 kilometers an hour, and from 14 backwards to 16 kilometers an hour. And so it's gone from feeling like pretty slow heavy tank to now feeling like it's a pretty nippy vehicle. And in real terms, that means that previously you had to use a turbo to feel that you were of okay speed inside World of Tanks. Now you could just drop the turbo, and while you lose the engine power, you could take a durability device in the current patch and still feel like you can manage to work it with the Type 71. And so the Type 71, I'd say it was the worst tier 10 heavy of all time. Why? Well, I've explained it all, but the main reason is that if you don't have hull armor, the only thing that you can do is just use the turret. And while Holddown is a great meme inside World of Tanks, and it has its place, and it can be very, very powerful indeed, but if you have worse hull armor than a Kranvang, for example, when you're sitting in a position like that, that means that you can never poke your opponents, and you're always waiting for them to come to you. And while, in some situations, you will be able to sit back and wait for your opponents to come to you and set the perfect ambush, where there's no artillery on the enemy team, and you can force all of your opponents to not push you because you can be able to get in a nice crossfire where your friends are going to be able to help you out to stop them from pushing you, or you can just fight the Panzer VII in that situation. So apart from in this scenario where a Type 71 just gets to sit at the back against no artillery and camp it out, this thing, my most hated tier 10 of all time. So much to hate about this vehicle, and I haven't even mentioned the weak point on top of the vehicle. Unfortunately, that weak point still remains, but having a vehicle that only focused on hull down, and that was its one trick, to also not be able to use that hull down all the time, because your opponents could easily be able to hit the weak points on top of this tank. And trust me, you don't actually have to be of Type 71 accuracy to hit this huge, awful crown that weighs heavy upon the Type 71's head. And so to come to a conclusion about the Type 71, you can have the most funky gun, you can have the most accurate gun, but if you don't have the damage per minute to go with it, it really doesn't mean much if you don't have any hull armor as well. Because unless your opponents have really soft turrets, or you can manage to hit weak points on top of theirs, and then they miss your gigantic weak point on top of yours, then if you can't expose your hull armor, heavy tanks just absolutely suck. And this is just it was basically just an STB1 from Wish.com. And the STB1 had the better heat pen, the STB1 had the better mobility, and the STB1 even had the better gun depression with 8 degrees over the front that I think goes up to 13 or 14 degrees with the hydropneumatic suspension of the tank. But I can tell you that with the buffs, this vehicle has gone from 0 to hero. Stay tuned to the channel as I'll be featuring this vehicle in its fully buffed state very soon. And while in this round it looked great, right? You know, we blocked 6,400 damage almost exclusively against our turret armor. We dealt 6,000 damage ourselves, which also manages to get us, well, not quite a high caliber there, but we fired a disgusting amount of gold and lost credits even with the Holiday Ops event. And it's just absolutely terrifying to think that this was kind of the ultimate situation for a Type 71, and it still just doesn't really feel that it could have achieved what many other heavies probably could have in the scenario. And so, good riddance to bad rubbish. Very aggressive buffs here by Wargaming to hopefully take the Type 71 from being the worst tier 10, in my opinion, of all time, to now being something that I truly can recommend is worth the grind. Anyway, ladies and gents, boys and girls, that was it for today. That is why the Type 71 was, in my opinion, the worst tier 10 of all time. Really hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, give it a thumbs up. If you hated it, give it a thumbs down. And let me know if you have played the Type 71 or played against it in the current patch, and is it overperforming? And as always, thank you so much for watching. You've been epic, and hopefully I'll see you soon.